Thank you so much to all of you for being here. I'm sorry for the slight delay, but it's Wednesday already, so it was expected. It is my great honor to present you Jamie Redgate, Dr. Jamie Redgate, who's here from the University of Glasgow, and it's an absolute pleasure to have him here for our third plenary lecture, in this case on called Moby Dick, or the Meatfiction. But before he begins his presentation, I would just like to introduce you to him. Jamie Redgate is the author of Meatfiction, The Treatment of Animals in the Contemporary American Novel, published by Palgrave last year. And he's a lecturer in English literature at the University of Glasgow and co-founder of the Studies of Meat in the Arts, not myth in the arts, like the one we have here. Studies of Meat in the Arts and Culture, Stomach, reading group. Jamie's essays have been published by Electric Literature, Unwinnable, Extra Teeth, and many other places. And his fiction has also been published on both sides of the Atlantic, in Ninth Letter, Propagule, and twice by Gutter, the magazine of New Scottish Writing. Most recently, his story Normal Person won third in the Cambridge Prize. And obviously, please make the most out of this opportunity for all of the students in the audience to ask any questions that you may have to Jamie, because it's such a great honor to have him here with us today. So whenever you want, Jamie.
Thank you. Do I need to turn on a mic? Hello. Everyone hear me okay? Do you know the lecturer's paradox? Raise your hand if you can't hear me. So thank you very much for having me. Thank you very much to the organisers for putting this on and for inviting me to such a beautiful part of the world. Spring has not really arrived yet in Scotland, and I'd started to forget what the colour green looked like, so it was nice to see it from the bus. So as Anna said, my name is Jamie Redgate, and I've been invited today really on the back of my recent publication, which, as you said, is Meatfiction, The Treatment of Animals in the Contemporary American Novel, which was published by Palgrave last year. And this project really began for me almost a decade ago, pretty much at the moment that I decided to stop eating animals. I ate meat until I was 27 years old. And it was only when I stopped that I began to realize that up until that point in my life, I'd bought into all the myths that I'd been sold all my life, that meat is natural, necessary, normal, that vegans eat rabbit food and bird seed and not much else. And I'm embarrassed to admit this one, but that if I stopped eating meat, that I would somehow be less of a man. I seem to have bought into that as well. And it was fascinating to discover when I stopped how untrue all that was, that the things that I thought were facts about meat were in fact fictions about meat. Stories we depend on to throw a kind of veil up between us and animals so that we don't actually have to see the suffering that goes on when we choose to eat them. At the same time that I began this quite personal transformation, I also began to see the tension between meat eating and veganism and the ethics of our consumption begin to play out on a much bigger stage, not just the stage of my own personal life. Meat is one of the issues of our time. And this is in part because of an ever-worsening climate crisis, which throws our abuses of the natural world and of animals into quite sharp relief. But it's also like climate change, meat has become a kind of political football, cultural football in the culture wars, especially in the United States of America, where it plays a foundational role in the mythology of that nation. Strangely, meat may be one of the few things that actually unites right and left in America, at least at the level of the political establishment. In 2021, Fox News, for example, accused Joe Biden and the Green New Deal of putting Americans' burgers at risk. And they threatened their listeners with the possibility that on July the 4th they would no longer have a steak to grill on the barbecue. They'd have to be grilling Brussels sprouts instead. Horrified at the suggestion, Joe Biden's team obviously quickly denied these claims, sharing a photo, this one here, of Biden smiling while working at a grill at a 2019 steak fry in Iowa. And this sort of bipartisan pandering to the meat eaters of America is still somehow even more grotesque under Donald Trump, who famously ordered McDonald's to the White House. So that the political class and the White House are sort of united on this topic in a strange way. Beyond the White House, meat is becoming a yet another football in the culture wars. Perhaps best summed up by the Beyond Meat debate that was held at the Oxford Union in 2021 on our side of the Atlantic. And this debate had on the one side Carol Adams, who I'm sure many of you will know, best known for the sexual politics of meat, in which she argues that vegetarianism does more than rebuke a meat-eating society, it rebukes a patriarchal society. So meat, and men like to turn women into meat and like to consume women's bodies in the same, and that same logic applies all the way down the kind of the structure. So to resist that structure from the ground up, to stop eating animals, is to resist the whole system. On the other side of that debate, so Carol Adams on the one side, you had Jordan Peterson's daughter, Michaela Fuller, making the case for the health benefits of their plant-free diet. So not a plant-based diet, but quite the opposite. And she argues, as she does on Jordan Peterson's website, that the ideological war on meat needs to end. So you have, in quite a stark way there, the battle lines being drawn, meat being at the centre of this interesting cultural war. On the one side, you have meat, which is masculine, rational, scientific, active, traditional. And then, of course, on the other side, you have veganism, which is woke, effeminate, passive, and progressive. Meat is such an interesting thing to me and such an interesting thing to study because I think the reason we're able to attach so many myths and ideas to meat is that meat itself has now so divorced from the reality of the animals we actually take it from, and of course from the conditions of factory farms from which most meat comes, and that we all know about, but which we prefer as a culture not to look at. It's been stripped of its bones, and you can kind of do anything with it once it becomes this object without signification. As Timothy Pascherat describes it, already stripped of all individuating characteristics of hide, horn, and sex, the carcass that reaches the cooler is further homogenized. The very texture of the flesh is reduced to one temperature, one consistency, one thing identical to the thing next to it, which is identical to the thousands of things next to it, all ready to be fabricated into a series of meat products. So we are allowed by the powers that be to imagine that meat is clean, ethical, readily available, there to be picked up off a shelf, and we get to ignore the reality. And though our culture may be fascinated with violence perpetrated on human beings, as Sune Borgfeldt writes, literature and film do not show fascination on a similar scale with the violence done to other animals or with the places where such violence happens. This becomes a sort of invisible background or foundation to our culture. Despite the fact that meat, by definition, cannot exist without violence, animals are, from the point of view of consumption, simply machines for manufacturing flesh, and we can devour meat without having to think about them at all. Nowhere is this more true than in the United States of America, what Annie Potts calls the meat culture, where the necessity and availability of meat is an article of the most profound faith. Increasingly, though, this is not true of American fiction, or of fiction about America or American capitalism from around the world. So in the last 10 years, I've not been alone in my growing awareness and understanding of where meat comes from. Like meat, veganism is also in the air. It's something people are talking about, whether talking about it well or badly. And I began to notice a trend in contemporary fiction towards novels about meat. And sometimes these are very explicitly about meat, and as in Tender as the Flesh and Barnate, for example, about the factory production of meat. Sometimes these novels are kind of nervously about meat, coming at meat from a sort of odd angle. And a lot of the time, these are novels by women writing about the experience of being a woman being treated like meat. So Han Kang's The Vegetarian is the kind of classic urtext of that. And this was of particular interest to me, these novels starting to show up on the bookshelves and show up on the tables in bookshops. Because before I ever thought about veganism, my research had always been on contemporary fiction on this period, with a particular focus on the latter half of the American century. It seemed to signal a kind of cultural shift or shift in publishing culture. So I'm talking in very broad strokes here, But the American century is roughly usually divided by critics into three different waves. So on the one hand, we have modernism at the start of the century. This is a sort of reaction to the 19th century, the Victorian period, the realists and the naturalists and so on. And so the modernism is often marked by a stream of consciousness narration, an emphasis on the mind, questions about knowledge and how we know things, a move towards kind of trying to find new mythologies, new narratives, new meaning. So Faulkner and James Joyce, for example, are the kind of classic modernists. After that first wave, you then have a second wave which reacts to the first one. So that sort of project of doubt and project of uncertainty following the Victorians is then becomes even worse. The doubt becomes even worse in postmodernism. Postmodernism, we see a shift to an emphasis on text and parody, metafictional sort of anxiety about the old stories of cause and effect, which are completely collapsing, and a new understanding of the quantum universe and a world of uncertainty and chaos, and so on. And then we have the third wave, which then reacts against postmodernism. And this has kind of been my subject of research up until this point. And it's been called various different things. Probably the worst name for it is postmodernism. In reaction to that earlier wave, we see a new emphasis on biology, on a new emphasis on the body and the brain, on genetic inheritance, on the kind of weight of the body and our connection to the material world, I suppose, at the same time as the rise of the internet and that kind of transcendency we were talking about earlier, which seems to threaten that. Or there's a good book called Reality Bites Back, for example, and that's a kind of key idea here, that we have these transcendent tech bro ideas about our escape from the body, but the body always has the last word. So though I've done my own part in my work in telling the story of the third wave, the postmodernist wave, animals are not really featured in that work at all, either in my own work up until this point or other people's work either. They've not been part of that story. And yet to go back and read all those authors I'd done for my PhD, to go back and look at that period in American literature where things begin to shift away from postmodernism with vegan eyeballs, is to suddenly sort of see the animals that were waiting for us there. This is an animal moment as well as a sort of human-bodied moment too. So in 1989, for example, David Foster Wallace published the novella Westward, the Course of Empire Takes Its Way. This was an explicitly postmodern story. He uses the phrase postmodern in it. It's very self-aware of its periodization. And it centers around characters who have been in McDonald's adverts for 50 years, and they're all going to gather together for one great final McDonald's advert. And he writes, describing the setting of the advert: twin arches of plated gold had been erected, each the size of St. Louis's gateway, and below their giant twin paraboloid zeniths, the gemmed altar that demands, recorded to let it give you a break. The predella itself is a lawn-sized golden patty, and everything that's been built, arches, altar, predella, has been perforated and filled to spurt and shower USDA grade A blood at the ecstatic moment. So, classic Wallace, very larger than life, a mixture of sort of spectacle and disgust at corporate America. And so all these characters are going to gather and be showered by blood in this ecstatic final advert. And it's in this story that Wallace coins the term, and in this moment, meatfiction, which is the one I borrowed for my title. So this is probably a terrible title because I've failed the first lesson of search engine optimization, because when you search for my book, Meatfiction, and Google suggests, did you mean metafiction? And this was sort of part of the point, because my argument, and this is following on from Wallace, is that what we can see in the meatfiction is an attempt to take the metafiction that had been so central to postmodern American fiction, that second wave, where it was used to puncture holes in the hypocritical narratives about the Vietnam War and Watergate and so on, to take those metafictional tools and then connect them now in this new wave with the great lies that we tell about meat. So postmodernist fiction was very paranoid and conspiratorial, and was very conscious of the fact that the powers that be in America are lying to you all the time. And you were using metafiction to poke holes in those narratives, to ask what it means to tell a narrative. And now in the meatfiction, that puncturing of those narratives is beginning to go in a new direction. So my project then, the Meatfictional project, began as an attempt to understand our current moment, to understand where we are culturally, but also to understand where fiction is and what fiction is doing and how it's evolving and changing in its shape in response to this moment. But the more I read, the more I began to realize that this is a much older story than just the last couple of decades. And the question of meat is one that goes to the heart of American literature itself, and maybe to the heart of literature itself in a big way. So postmodern metafiction drew a lot of its power from its rejection of realist conventions. So literary realism, as Ian Watt has argued, has its origins in Descartes and Locke, and a view that human beings are rational, reliable observers of reality. So when we read realism, we are invited to believe that it is an ideologically neutral observation of the world. There's a clear window of clear glass through which we look through the world and see it as it is, because the writer can observe it, and so we can observe it, and we can all be objective and sort of see the same thing. This assumption, however, that you don't see the glass that you're looking through, means that realism, as a rule, tends to also tacitly endorse the dominant ideology of the day through what Patricia Wall calls a continuous process of naturalization. So we are always seeing through glass when we read fiction. When we read fiction, when we read realism, we're invited not to think about the glass. Metafiction points to the glass all the time. So we live today, as Melanie Joy puts it in the second quote here, not in a democracy, but in a meatocracy, in which the three ends of justification, that meat is normal, natural, and necessary, are so ingrained in our social consciousness that they guide our actions without even having to think about them. So we live in a world in which ag-gag laws make it illegal to record inside farms, and in which it would be election ending to criticise the meat industry, not least because the population at large would not stand for that. They have already internalised, to quote Joy, the tenets of a carnist ideology so fully that we often live in accordance with them as though they were universal truths rather than widely held opinions. So the fact that we think of meat eating as natural, or something that always annoys me is people talk about quote-unquote normal milk to distinguish it from oat milk or soya milk. So we see meat and dairy products as natural and normal, whereas veganism and vegetarianism are seen as a choice, an aberration. Or the fact that it could be possible to believe as an educated adult that dairy cows simply leak milk and they're glad to be milked, or that pigs live less rich internal lives than dogs, goes some way to explaining the moral schizophrenia we are able to live with when we call slaughter humane but do not apply animal welfare laws to chickens, or when we understand that our companion animals have unique personalities and should be named and should be loved, but we assume that food animals do not, for some reason. A helpful reason for the meat industry. As in life, as the same rules in life apply in fiction, and that characters can eat meat without raising an eyebrow, readers are not invited to notice if a character is eating bacon or a dead pig unless an author draws attention to it. So in the same way that metafiction, the sort of tricks of metafiction, can break the fourth wall and remind us as we're reading of the strings behind the narrative, remind us that what we're reading is not true and objective, that someone is controlling that narrative, so meatfiction can use those same techniques, use the same literary tricks to poke holes in the carnist narrative that we all live in, to remind us that when someone's eating bacon, they're actually eating a dead pig, for example. So my argument then, or one of my arguments in meatfiction, is that just as the novel seems to become sort of self-aware in the middle of the American century, with postmodern metafiction, it sort of becomes aware of itself as text, as a thing that's being written, as a fiction that's being invented. So at the end of the century, in that third wave of modernism, the novel begins to become self-aware about the construction of meat itself. But one of the key insights of criticism of metafiction is that the novel has always been metafictional. It's always been aware of itself as text. We just sort of forgot that for a while, and then it became very metafictional in the middle of the 20th century. My argument is that the novel has always been about meat. It's always been about animals. But it's becoming sort of self-conscious of that fact at the end of the 20th century and into our century now. So to read meatfictionally, to read for the meat-fictional tendencies in fiction, is to read with an eye for what was always there, but which authors can begin to sort of point us towards. American literature is a particularly fascinating tradition in this regard, because there is nothing real at all about America. America is itself a giant fiction. the dream of Europe written onto virgin land. And if the American writer, as Leslie Fiedler once put it, inhabits a country at once the dream of Europe and a fact of history, then it matters when Europe was dreaming. It matters that America was founded when Europe's dreams were bound by an enlightened view of the earth, something to be subdued, that the woods should be cut down, the soil tilled, the predators killed off, the landscape drained and reshaped, and all that chaos put back into order. So the novel has always sort of been an anthropological machine, as Dominic O'Kee writes. It's a device with which we construct our own humanity in opposition to the things that we aren't. So we define ourselves by the animal that we aren't. We define ourselves as the meat that we are not, because we don't think of ourselves as edible. If that's the case, then the novel's arrival in America provides a really stark illustration of the guilt and the horror which attend the catastrophe that was our second encounter with paradise. And the American romance in the 19th century, Melville being a great proponent of that, and this has been called by Richard Chase the American genre, the kind of defining form of the novel, of the American novel, was, like metafiction, also defined against or in opposition to the realism that it wasn't. It's a counter-Enlightenment tradition which bared its heart to the symbolic, the sensual, the melodramatic, and the metafictional. So instead of the sort of staid British novel, which is very in its tea rooms and very proper, the American novel, the American romance, is very gothic, very dark, very kind of larger than life. And Fiedler argues that it's precisely because of that. It's about the difference between an English garden, say, and the American wild, the American forest. To put it another way, you need to be able to dream in order to have nightmares. And this explains why America's national literature, though it was set in a land of affirmation, a land of paradise, was to become one of darkness and the grotesque and the gothic. So as Fiedler puts it, Americans had left behind the terror of Europe, not for the innocence it dreamed of, but for the new and special guilts associated with the rape of nature and the exploitation of dark-skinned people. It's because the dream of America was so great and so bright and so extraordinary that the horrors were also so stark, that those two things sort of go in hand. And this, as a reader, makes for a really interesting national literature. So probably the most important reading of the American Romantic tradition is Toni Morrison's Playing in the Dark. The previous critics had seen in the American romance an encounter with wildness itself. So the encounter with the forest, the encounter with the savage, and so on. Morrison argues that if American literature was frightened and haunted from its inception, then that repressed darkness was objectified as an Africanist presence, a fear of blackness specifically. And the impetus for Morrison's argument was the studied indifference of literary criticism, which had neglected to read race as a fundamental, indeed a defining force in American literature, something she was trying to correct. What is fascinating, writes Morrison, is how writers and critics alike manage not to see what is right in front of them. Morrison writes that an instructive parallel to this willed scholarly indifference is the centuries-long hysterical blindness to feminist discourse and the way in which women and women's issues were also read or unread. So one instructive parallel speaks to another. Feminist critics had already made that case. Morrison is making it on the point of race. But it also, we can see the same effect in our studied indifference to the lives of animals as well. And what makes, to follow from Morrison, what makes American literature's engagement with meat and the animal, like its engagement with race, so very interesting, is precisely that it is completely troubled and hidden and secretive. You have to kind of go looking for it, but it is always there. In the pressure cooker of a culture that normalizes the mass slaughter of animals, we can see, especially in a tradition that's informed by that early romanticism, which held on to the belief that the universe has a moral structure, that evil might exist, we can see those feelings of guilt and remorse begin to burst up through the pages, even if their authors sometimes didn't notice it. So as Morrison puts it, national literatures do seem to end up describing and inscribing what is really on the national mind. So they can't help, even though slavery sort of weirdly doesn't feature. She makes this case that in the early American writing, it also is always there. You can't, if you're a writer looking at your country, you can't not see it, but it sort of bubbles up in a way that they maybe didn't intend. So in the meat culture, to revisit it with vegan eyeballs, as I say, that was once paradise on earth, guilt is never very far away, and we can see it in American writing. So Leo Marx famously argued in his 1964 book, The Machine in the Garden, that American literature was profoundly shaped by the interruption of modernity into its pastoral dream, an interruption which was ongoing and growing, quote, increasingly violent as we approach our own time. This is in the 1960s. 60 years on, the claim is only more compelling. And the history of meat production from 1900 to the present, as Macquarie and Miller write in their introduction to literature and meat since 1900, stands as a stark example of these broader processes of modernization and intensification. So first of all, an intensification of speed, as farmers and slaughterhouse workers reared, killed and processed animals for the market at an ever-increasing pace. And secondly, an astonishing scaling up of animal agribusiness, with more and more corpses produced each year to satisfy the modern consumer market's growing appetite for animal flesh. So absolutely an interruption of modernity into the pastoral dream. The United States of America was the pioneer of industrialized factory farming and the vertical integration of farming systems that saw the lives of animals controlled from breeding all the way to birth, all the way to death. And so animals are completely central to the American story. The American continent, as I was saying, was a sort of rediscovered Garden of Eden. What it became was ground zero for intensive farming practices and industrialized slaughter, which has seen animals transformed into mechanized units of production. European settlers brought plenty to the great American desert by turning it into ranches, and the railway brought those cows straight to the Chicago stockyards, where the disassembly line would give Henry Ford the model for his own factory. Dead whales oiled the first wheels of the Industrial Revolution and the space race alike. And American writers cannot now help but know this. They have to know this, even if they do not want to. So my book largely focused on contemporary fiction. I thought today I would take the opportunity to broaden the definition of meat fiction, broaden the scope by going back 150 years to look at the novel that is foundational both to the American story and to American literature, which is Moby Dick. And Richard nicely contextualizes for me by talking about Melville already. So this decision on my part was inspired by the news at the moment, which is full of stories of a mad Captain Ahab at the head of this ship of state. But it was also inspired too by the whaling history of the Basque Country itself, this being the first place to hunt whales for commercial purposes. But primarily I wanted to consider how this early novel embodies the same tensions that we see in modern meat fiction, and to test my theory that all novels are in fact about meat, even when they don't necessarily mean to be. Melville was ahead of its time in so many ways. It feels like a modern novel when you read it now. And so this is in some way also an advert for this book. So you may have heard the phrase, the great American novel, which is a literary project. Other countries don't really have this. America certainly does. And it's the idea that a novel itself could in some way embody the whole project of America. That as America is a story being written into being, so a novel can capture it in all its grandeur and its complexity as well. And there are different contenders. And Moby Dick, if it is anything, is surely a contender for that title. In his book on the subject, where you'll notice the whaling ship on the very cover of the book, Lawrence Buell reads Moby Dick as a book about democracy and capitalism. And he writes, although hardly the only fruitful way of reading Moby Dick, certainly of great importance is its politico-economic allegory of the Pequod as an image of the new factory system and the appalling working conditions and multiple hazards to which the workforce was subjected, of the aggrandizement of the Anglo-overseer class at the expense of the heteroglot subalterns on whose labour they depended, and of the insouciance with which the owners and captains of Yankee whalers strove to harvest the wonders of the oceanic world. Now, you may have heard of Malcolm in the Middle, And there's a very great episode, I think, in season 2, where the gifted class are reading Moby Dick together, and their teacher, rather cruelly, is ranking them. And if they give a good answer, they go up the board, and if they give a bad answer, they go to the bottom. And all the students are giving wonderful readings of the white whale as a model of capitalism, a model of God. And then one poor student suggests that we shouldn't forget that he is also a whale, and that it is about whaling. And he describes the whaling industry as his name slowly goes down the board. But unfortunately, I'm going to do that today. And we're going to think also about the whale as a whale. But it's fascinating that meat should be at the very heart of the story that has since come to be read as one of America's greatest books. The fact that it should be in Malcolm in the Middle as a sort of point of reference is a really significant thing. This is true, the centrality of meat is true in a literal sense. Moby Dick is literally about a slaughterhouse at sea. And I would add to Beale's description the multiple hazards that whales suffered, never mind the workers who brought the hazards to bear on them. But meat is also central in the kind of more interesting sense, in a way that the fiction of meat, the construction of meat in literary terms, is itself tried and tested across the book. Ishmael, our narrator, wears a whaler's mask as he celebrates this great whaling industry, this very American industry. But that mask begins to slip here and there throughout the novel in the language that he uses, and horror begins to shine through. So what I want to argue today, one of the reasons that Moby Dick is great, and one of the reasons that it's still great, is that it is utterly confused on the point of the whale and of meat. And confusion is interesting. It helps a book to have a legacy and to last, because it doesn't give you its answers. The novel is certainly not a straightforward argument against meat eating. It's certainly not a straightforward argument against whaling, but neither is it really for either of those things. And it is possible now to read the novel and feel for the whale at its center. And the novel absolutely rewards you for doing so. And Moby Dick has long rewarded readers who tried to find in the white whale some greater meaning. As Ishmael puts it, whiteness seems to sort of stand for everything. It can be any color. Or whiteness it consists of all colours. Like the whale itself, standing for everything and being read as anything. So whaling comes, in Ishmael's view, to stand for just about everything as well. So, what was America in 1492 but a loose fish in which Columbus struck the Spanish standard by way of waifing it for his royal master and mistress? What was Poland to the Tsar? What Greece to the Turk? What India to England? What at last will Mexico be to the United States? All loose fish. What are the rights of man and the liberties of the world but loose fish? What all men's minds and opinions but loose fish? What is the principle of religious belief in them but a loose fish? What to the ostentatious smuggling verbalists are the thoughts of thinkers but loose fish? What is the great globe itself but a loose fish? And what are you, reader, but a loose fish, and a fast fish too? So as Melville hooks the reader, turns them from a loose fish into a fast fish. That's the same way that Columbus hooked America, as slaves were hooked by white settlers, so whales are hooked by the brave men who hunt them. And whaling in this view, as Melville's wonderful sort of alliterative rhythm to this passage and the patterning of it reminds us, is but one arm of a branching project in a world in which resources are for the taking, and the winner takes everything. Though this is in part a reflection of an American at a very particular moment when a kind of hyper-capitalist economy is beginning to emerge in his time, Melville also sees something essentially natural in the world of predator and prey. The whalemen are merely one new evolution in a long, ongoing story. So Tashtego's long, lean, sable hair, his high cheekbones and black rounding eyes, for an Indian, oriental in their largeness, but Antarctic in their glittering expression. All this sufficiently proclaimed him an inheritor of the unvitiated blood of those proud warrior hunters who, in quest of the great New England moose, had scoured, bow in hand, the aboriginal forests of the Main. Very Avatar. But no longer snuffing in the trail of the wild beasts of the woodland, Tashtego now hunted in the wake of the great whales of the sea, the unerring harpoon of the sun fitly replacing the infallible arrow of the sires. So Melville was writing only a few years before Darwin, but he knew that about the discovery of the great extinct giants, dinosaurs, although they didn't know they were dinosaurs yet. And he knew that mankind was simply one species among others, a blip on this ever-lengthening timeline of life, increasingly going longer. and yet what a blip we are. Thrust into this ancient world, human beings have completely remade it. The forests have been cut down, the lands conquered, and now man goes to sea in this passage as if it were the very final frontier, the last place to go. So this proto-Darwinian view of life, of man as a member of the great struggle for resources in which the fittest survive, unsettles the assumption that white Europeans and their American descendants are civilized beings and quite distinct from the animals and the savages against which they set themselves, against which civilization defines themselves as a thing they are not. The Pequod, for example, the famous ship, is described as follows. She was apparelled like any barbarian Ethiopian emperor, his neck heavy with pendants of polished ivory. She was a thing of trophies, a cannibal of a craft, tricking herself forth in the chased bones of her enemies. All round her unpanelled open bulwarks were garnished like one continuous jaw, with the long sharp teeth of the sperm whale inserted there for pins, to fasten her old hempen thews and tendons to. So it's really significant that the ship that should be the centre of our story, the Pequod, should become a kind of whale's mouth, both devouring and digesting everything in front of it, and yet becoming the very monster that it's supposed to be setting out to kill. So, like in the way that the civilized person encounters the savage and treats them savagely, so the Pequod, it's the civilized ship, goes out to kill monsters and becomes one. Indeed, becomes far worse than the monster it ever set its eyes on. So the whales here are a resource to be plundered, to be eaten up in that great mouth, primarily for their clean, pure oil. But to get to that oil, you have to go through the messiness of meat. Now, I think I'm doubling up on Richard's quotation here, but it's a good passage, deserves rereading twice. So it is not, perhaps, entirely because the whale is so excessively unctuous that landsmen seem to regard the eating of him with abhorrence. That appears to result in some way from the consideration before mentioned, i.e., that a man should eat a newly murdered thing of the sea and eat it too by its own light. So eating by the light of a whale oil lamp. But no doubt the first man that ever murdered an ox was regarded as a murderer. Perhaps he was hung, and if he had been put on his trial by oxen, he certainly would have been. And he certainly deserved it, if any murderer does. Ishmael gets caught up on the meat here, and there's a sense that comes through of the moral crime in which he is implicated. The use of the word murder, which we normally reserve for human beings and not for non-human animals, is really interesting. But it's also interesting that this is a crime in which not just he is implicated, but we all are, if we belong to the race of mankind. So this really interesting quote continues, and this is where I'm doubling up. Go to the meat market of a Saturday night and see the crowds of live bipeds staring up at the long rows of dead quadrupeds. Does not that sight take a tooth out of the cannibal's jaw? Cannibals? Who is not a cannibal? I tell you, it will be more tolerable for the Fiji that salted down a lean missionary in his cellar against a coming famine. It will be more tolerable for that provident Fiji, I say, in the day of judgment, than for thee, civilized and enlightened gourmand, who nailest geese to the ground and feastest on their bloated livers in thy pâté de foie gras. So by unanthropomorphizing us, by making us bipeds among the quadrupeds, Ishmael erases that distinction that we normally rely on, as he erases the distinction between us, the civilized, and them, the cannibals. There's also a curious defensiveness on Ishmael's part here in these chapters. I think he assumes that the reader will think of him and his profession as savage, him as a butcher, and he seems to want to defend it from that accusation. And yet he also has to accept that that accusation is not wrong in any way. It is true. Yet by accepting it, by accepting that he is a butcher, he also throws it back in the reader's face. But Stubb, he eats the whale by his own light, does he? And that is adding insult to injury, is it? Look at your knife handle there, my civilized and enlightened gourmand, dining off that roast beef. What is that handle made of? What but the bones of the brother of the very ox you are eating? So in the same way that the Pequod is decked out in the bones of the whale, so the person who is apparently civilized, the reader of the book, who eats beef, the more civilized meat, is also decking out his equipment in bones as well. So if we, the civilized, are to continue to eat meat, Ishmael reminds us that butchery has to happen somewhere. The would that it did not, but progress is long in coming, and it is implied here, perhaps impossible as well. Life is sort of vulture-ish by definition, and there's no getting away from the universal cannibalism of the sea, the eternal war since the world began. This, at least, is how Ishmael justifies his participation in slaughter. But I wonder if we're supposed to accept his justification. I think Melville puts the lie to the idea that civilization and slaughter are odds with each other. They are opposites. Civilization, like the Pequod, is if anything more savage than the savages, more monstrous than the monsters. In the middle of the 19th century, whales were still deeply mysterious. The monsters of the deep who had only been glimpsed by their fins and their tails, or if they were beached. And as Ahab hunts his white whale to death, Ishmael has his own project, which is to try to hunt down the very idea of the whale, to put it into words. And in the famously long, rather interminable cetology chapters, Ishmael attempts to catalogue every single whale according to the size of books, which is a really sort of interesting metafictional move on his part. So I won't read all this, but first, according to magnitude, I divide the whales into 3 primary books, subdivisible into chapters, and these shall comprehend them all, both large and small. 1, the folio whale, 2, the octavo whale, 3, the duodecimo whale, and so on and so forth. There is something amusing about Ishmael's treatment of nature as a sort of book that he can interpret and read or put into words. But there's also something quite uncomfortable about it as well, an absurdity perhaps of the very act of categorization. It may, in the end, simply be impossible to make the whale into a book, to capture a whale in words. But if a whale can't be a book, is it possible for a book to become a whale? Moby Dick is a deeply metafictional text, and a novel ahead of its time for that reason, I think, attuned throughout to the power and the potential of language, yet also to the limitations of that language. In an effort to capture a thing bigger than itself, the novel itself becomes a kind of Leviathan. Moby Dick is famously very long, difficult to read. This massive object that stands as a testament to both its success and its failure in capturing its central subject. In this, Melville anticipates the great encyclopedic fictions of the 20th century, so Thomas Pynchon's Gravity's Rainbow, Wallace's Infinite Jest, and others, that attempted in some way to contain everything about their culture in one book, everything about their cultural moment. But that project has its own failure built into it because the form of the novel has an opening page and a last page. It is by nature finite, so it cannot, therefore, be infinite. And it's interesting that for Moby Dick and for Melville, this encyclopedic tendency is completely wrapped up with meat from the beginning. So there's a lovely example later on in the novel where Ishmael says, I found a long detailed list of the outfits for the larders and cellars of 180 sail of Dutch whalemen, from which list, as translated by Dr. Snodhead, I transcribed the following. 400,000 pounds of beef, 60,000 pounds Friesland pork, 150,000 pounds of stocked fish, and so on and so forth. Most statistical tables are parchingly dry in the reading, not so in the present case. At the time, I devoted 3 days to the studious digesting of all this beer, beef, and bread, during which many profound thoughts were incidentally suggested to me. So this again feels very ahead of its time. The idea that information is something to be consumed and digested, something we can sort of get choked up on, that information is a resource in and of itself. And again, there is an inherent comedy in the idea that our individual narrator should be digesting 400,000 pounds of beef himself. But the joke is in part a sort of result of the shock of that number, the idea that how many cows would that equal? How many cows would there need to be for Ishmael to chew through to have chewed 400,000 pounds of beef? What the joke reminds us is that the very act of categorization, the very act of counting and tallying and building up together the language games, in other words, that we play with animal lives, has an inherent violence to it. It enacts the very same reduction that slaughter does. The whale itself, at the heart of the novel, is subject to the same reduction to text and detail. And one of the problems with Melville, it's very hard to stop quoting. So this is quite a long one, but I hope you'll see why. So since I have undertaken to handle this Leviathan, it behooves me to prove myself omnisciently exhaustive in the enterprise, not overlooking the minutest seminal germs of his blood and spinning him out to the uttermost coil of his bowels. Having already described him in most of his present habitatory and anatomical peculiarities, it now remains to magnify him in an archaeological, fossiliferous, and antediluvian point of view. Applied to any other creature than the Leviathan, to an ant or a flea, such portly terms might justly be deemed unwarrantably grandiloquent, but when Leviathan is the text, the case is altered. Fain am I to stagger to this emprise under the weightiest words of the dictionary, and here be it said that whenever it has been convenient to consult one in the course of these dissertations, I have invariably used a huge quarto edition of Johnson, expressly purchased for that purpose. Because that famous lexicographer's uncommon personal bulk more fitted him to compile a lexicon to be used by a whale author like me. One often hears of writers that rise and swell with their subject, though it may seem but an ordinary one. How then with me, writing of this Leviathan? Unconsciously, my chirography expands into placard capitals. Give me a condor's quill. Give me a Vesuvius's crater for an inkstand. Friends, hold my arms. For in the mere act of penning my thoughts of this Leviathan, they weary me and make me faint with their outreaching comprehensiveness of sweep, as if to include the whole circle of the sciences and all the generations of whales and men and mastodons past, present, and to come, with all the revolving panoramas of empire on earth and throughout the whole universe, not excluding its suburbs. Such and so magnifying is the virtue of a large and liberal theme. We expand to its bulk. To produce a mighty book, you must choose a mighty theme. No great and enduring volume could ever be written on the flea, though many there be who have tried it. So, you need a big dictionary, in other words, a Noah's Ark of the biggest words to describe nature's giants. And it takes a big book, a leviathan of a book, to capture a leviathan in language. That is the project of Moby Dick in some way. It becomes, Moby Dick is called Moby Dick or The Whale, and the novel is The Whale. And yet I think that book is also a failure in a most profound way. Indeed, in some of Melville's prose, which is so alive with life and wit all the way through the book, it's also dead in a strange way because it cannot go where it wants to. It cannot be everywhere at once. And the maximalism of the novel is at odds with itself. It's at odds with the minds of readers who can only be in one place at a time. So there's really interesting examples of this throughout. So in the tumultuous business of cutting in and attending to a whale, there's much running backwards and forwards among the crew. Now hands are wanted here, and then again hands are wanted there. It is much the same with him who endeavours the description of the scene. So the describer of the scene is sort of too busy, can't be everywhere he wants to be at once. It must be borne in mind that all this time we have a sperm whale's prodigious head hanging to the Pequod side, but we must let it continue hanging there a while till we can get a chance to attend to it. For the present, other matters press, and the best we can do now for the head is to pray heaven the tackles hold. So I've described the head, and it's going to hang there while I now go and describe something else, and you just have to hold it there for a moment. But as the colossal skull embraces so very large a proportion of the entire extent of the skeleton, and as nothing is to be repeated concerning it in this chapter, you must not fail to carry it in your mind or under your arm as we proceed, otherwise you will not gain a complete notion of the general structure we are about to view. So the narrative throughout is trying to take this shape that can contain everything, yet it is limited, sort of by definition, by the logic of the very body that is doing the observing. So it's in the same way that it's limited by the very logic of the novel itself. The logic of the prose sentence. A sentence can only contain so much and can only be in so many places at once. And so as a result, we, the reader, have to kind of hold it under our arms, keep the head of the whale under our arms while we listen to this new information. And we can never see the whale as a whole because it's only ever in parts. The resultant reduction of the whale to its parts, chapters are devoted to its tail, to its spine, its blowhole, and so on, ultimately speaks, I think, to the central problem of the novel, which is that in order to study a thing, you have to kill it. The whale itself, for all of Melville's mastery of description, remains ultimately inaccessible. Its intelligence remains a mystery. The thing that it is while it's alive, when it's animated, when it's not just its parts, remains to us inaccessible. And Ishmael knows this, and he hates that he knows this, and his project becomes increasingly difficult as he begins to try to describe the indescribable. So he writes, "It was a black and hooded head, and hanging there in the midst of so intense a calm, it seemed the sphinxes in the desert. Speak, This is Ahab speaking. Speak, thou vast and venerable head, which, through ungarnished with a beard, yet here and there lookest hoary with mosses. Speak, mighty head, and tell us the secret thing that is in thee. Of all divers thou hast dived the deepest, that head upon which the upper sun now gleams has moved amid this world's foundations, where unrecorded names and navies rust, and untold hopes and anchors rot, where in her murderous hold this frigate earth is ballasted with bones of millions of the drowned. There in that awful water land there was thy most familiar home. O head, thou hast seen enough to split the planets and make an infidel of Abraham, and not one syllable is thine. I love this passage. It feels like Milton and Lord of the Rings wrapped up in one. And I think it's the appeals to an ancient world, a truly ancient place, more ancient even than Egypt and the Sphinx, which invites us to understand that the whale is something that is completely beyond us. It's a creature that knows something that we do not, and it's some font of ancient truth that if only we could access it, we could know something profound. And yet it's something also for which our language is utterly inadequate. We have to reach, and it's telling here that Melville reaches for the religious, the sublime, almost the Lovecraftian. It's something beyond what words can say. And the fact that the whale has no syllables of its own, it's really significant that because syllables are ours in some way, the whale does not speak, or not speak in a way that we can understand them as syllables. Most importantly, though, this does not mean that he has seen nothing. It means that he's seen more than we can ever know. And this is a problem for Ishmael, because Ishmael, in his anthropocentric way, in his sort of comically anthropocentric way, cannot understand how a whale sees at all. So he writes, now from this peculiar sideway position of the whale's eyes, it is plain that he can never see an object which is exactly ahead, no more than he can one exactly astern. In a word, the position of the whale's eyes corresponds to that of a man's ears, and you may fancy for yourself how it would fare with you did you sideways survey objects through your ears. You would find that you could only command some 30 degrees of vision in advance of the straight sideline of sight, and about 30 more behind it. If your bitterest foe were walking straight towards you with dagger uplifted in broad day, you would not be able to see him any more than if he were stealing upon you from behind. In a word, you would have two backs, so to speak, but at the same time also two fronts, side fronts. For what is it that makes the front of a man? What indeed but his eyes? So our own language here, which is revealed to be deeply anthropocentric, falls apart on animals of other designs that don't match ours. How can a whale be said to have a front at all, or a face, if he doesn't have two eyes in place and a nose? What would it mean? What would the front mean to an animal that has two fronts? How can we think of it in those ways? And moments like this remind us that we can only ever look out through our own faces, that we can only ever think in our own terms. And this frustrates Ishmael so much. He says, the more I consider this mighty tale, the more do I deplore my inability to express it. Dissect him how I may then, but I go but skin deep. I know him not and never will. But if I know not even the tail of this whale, how understand his head? Much more how comprehend his face, when face he has none. So the homophonic play on the word tail there, tail and tail, is another metafictional reminder that Ishmael can only speak superficially in language, in human terms, of what is ultimately beyond language and beyond human terms. It is interesting that he is also deeply aware of this all the time, and his awareness of it is a strange sort of generosity on his part, a recognition that for all he has gained in his dissection of the whale and his cutting it up, all that we have gained in our developing picture of that animal, there is also more that is being lost. So we know more and more and more, and we dig deeper and deeper into his body, and yet ultimately we lost the kind of one thing you were looking for in a way. And yet for Ishmael or Melville to figure the whale as strange, as something beyond language, is also arguably an example of what de Waal calls anthropodenial. So the assumption that the whale should be so alien to us as to be incomprehensible, and that we should be wrong in ever suggesting that it has an eyes, a face, an identity at all. A sort of fear of anthropomorphizing it, because we shouldn't say that an animal has eyes or emotions or feelings, is a kind of then anthropodenial. Because of course they do. We're related to them. In Darwinian terms, the whales are our cousins, our distant relatives. And for all our philosophizing about their difference and their inaccessibility, to see these whales suffer is to see suffering. And we should not ignore or deny. And Ishmael certainly does not. So in the height of the novel, when it's coming to this great chase, and at last the hunt is sort of coming to its head, it's also horrifying. So it was a terrific, most pitiable and maddening sight. The whale was now going head out and sending his spout before him in a continual tormented jet, while his one poor fin beat his side in an agony of fright. So Ishmael glories in this great whale hunt, but he also recognizes its horror all the time. And it's part now of why we can look at Moby Dick and we can read it and root for the whale rather than for Ahab. The gift of Moby Dick is that despite the period in which it was written, despite the grandstanding of its narrator in some moments, it was always also generous to the whale. Generous in the sense that it recognized its similarities to us. Generous in the sense that it also recognized its profound difference. It's a creature with which we share the world and which can suffer, even as it's very, very different indeed. So Moby Dick was published at what might be the perfect moment when religious language was not yet completely hollowed out, and the whale, because it was mysterious, retained some of the grandeur it had accrued from its adventure at the edges of our maps. The grenade harpoon had not yet been invented, and the radar that meant that the United States Army could use whales for target practice in the Cold War was a distant dream. Whaling was still romantic in some way, just before it was about to become very not romantic. Life now is different for us and for the whale. We have discovered their music and begun, I hope, to lament their loss as well. Yet even if we had a moratorium on all whale hunting, we may yet still kill them through our desire for meat of other kinds. In a recent Guardian article, it describes the most environmentally ruinous industrial workplaces on Earth in the Antarctic, where not whales exactly, but the krill are harvested at extraordinary scale so that we can turn them into ruby red fish oil capsules sold in health food stores, as well as the fish meal used to give farm-fed salmon its pink hue. So even if we stop killing whales, we may still kill them by destroying the foundation of their food system. To read Moby Dick now is to be reminded that we don't know what we are killing when we do. We can measure the meat and measure whales in kilograms and cut the meat down to its smallest pieces, but still know nothing. And yet, knowing nothing does not mean that there is nothing. What Moby Dick teaches us, I think, is that nothing is, in fact, a gift. The nothing that we don't know should be celebrated, protected, precisely because we do not know it. But we have to frame that nothing as well. We have to look at it. We have to capture it perhaps in words as best we can, because our failure on that front is something to celebrate. We should celebrate our failure. As Ishmael puts it, and here's my last slide, but how? Genius in the sperm whale? Has the sperm whale ever written a book, spoken a speech? No. His great genius is declared and is doing nothing particular to prove it. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your wonderful lecture, Jamie. There's so many ideas that I've written down, and this very insightful commentary on a I don't know if perhaps a new reading or maybe a less studied reading of Moby Dick that maybe some people weren't aware of before the lecture. So thank you very much. I would like to open the floor for any questions that may arise if we
So while people are thinking, hi, I am going to cheat and use my powers, my guy to ask first. So wonderful talk. I am the cannibalism guy here because I am working on a PhD on cannibalism and queer readings on it. It's really fun that I've also found a starting point on Moby Dick regarding English fiction because it happens. But I was thinking how in contemporary cannibal literature, it's really, I've found, not only in English one, but also in the vegetarian, tendencies, the flesh, etc., all around the globe, how we're decentering animals, I think, because it is very common, I think, you find these narratives, especially around sexism, but also around, I am studying queer stuff, so, more othering relationships or ways of being, but animals are hardly ever found there, which I think it's really interesting, especially finding Moby Dick also as a starting point where the animal is the point. So I was wondering which were your thoughts on that, in that decentering, if it's something good that we are not involved in them, or if you know that we should also put them in the picture and decenter ourselves, as it often happens.
That's a really interesting question. I have a whole chapter on contemporary cannibal narratives, particularly weird cannibal narratives by young women who use the cannibal as a sort of romantic fantasy, that the misunderstood individual who, you know, is sort of a stand-in for a queer relationship in some way. That they, I'm thinking of Bones and All, for example, which you might have read. That they don't fit in the world, and that we can sort of empathize with that feeling, but it's sort of morally barren. the assumption that could you have to forget what they're actually doing, actually murdering people and eating them, to read that as a sort of hopeful, happy romance in some way. And it's sort of, it's my view anyway. And it's the one thinks of Carol Adams and the absent reference. I think it's really important there. The idea that, and this is where contemporary fiction is really interesting, because I think there's a publishing trend now towards understanding fiction, particularly by young women, and a feeling in sort of late capitalist society that they are treated like objects, treated like meat, which I think is absolutely true. But they're kind of flirting with meat as a kind of metaphor for their own suffering, and yet ignoring, as Carol Adams would put it, the suffering that the metaphor depends upon. To be treated like meat, the metaphor only works because we know how meat is treated. We know how the animals that are made into meat are treated, such that we can understand the horror of a woman being treated like meat. And they seem, for a large part, to ignore that. And I think cannibalism is interesting in that regard, because it's about meat eating. It's about the treating of people as objects and treating of people as resources for one's own pleasure or whatever. But it brings it back into the little human circle. It's a human moral problem, rather than applying that outward, I suppose. And yeah, so it's to read something like Bones and All, or A Certain Hunger, and these sorts of things. It's just sort of, I always find reading the Goodreads reviews of these books really fascinating.
It absolutely is.
Yeah.
It's a whole other world out there.
Yes, because they seem so much to not notice what I would notice, which is, like, Tender as the Flesh is the perfect example of that. Tender as the Flesh should be making you think about factory farming that goes on in our world. And to read that novel and to think, God, wouldn't it be awful if we ate humans? It seems to me to be missing the point. And be treated like an escapist fantasy. Again, a very human fantasy. It's comforting and amusing to think in dystopian terms about ourselves. It's uncomfortable to think about the dystopias in which animals already live, and on which we base our own dystopias. And I think we probably shouldn't forget that. I think the publishing trend, while claiming to be progressive and interesting and challenging, is in fact not.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions in the room, or in the chat as well? Yes.
Thank you. That was quite exhilarating and in scope and content. Just a quick extrapolation from what you were saying about Wallace. In a supposedly fun thing, for example, most of the essays are about addiction, but several on the cruise ship and on the fair and so forth are about food addiction. And Wallace would admit that this is an extrapolation of his own psychology, but his take on America generally is that it's a society defined by consumption as addiction, and all forms, of addiction, whether it was pornography or entertainment, but food, especially in the context you're talking about, and it becomes carnivalesque and grotesque, and for him, and that made me think then for Wallace, but also in your sense of things, and particularly in the contemporary novels that you're addressing. Is food consumption then itself a model of addictive, destructive behavior, that is itself the cause of all these other ailments, or is it a symptom of something else? I know that's sort of an unanswerable question, but I think it might be productive to talk about. You know, when you think about what else it's a symptom of, then you might reductively wind up with capitalism or patriarchy, maybe, you know. But I'm curious if you thought about contextualizing it in that context.
I love questions I can't answer. Yes, I mean, I think that addictive logic that you see across supposedly fun things is sort of central to infinite jest as well. And the patterns whereby the thing in infinite jest is you produce waste that produces energy that produces more waste. It's that sort of thing. And I think there's something similar in the way that factory farming, is, for example, has an addictive logic, because you cram chickens into cages in which they then begin to act very violently or naturally, or peck each other or harm each other. And so you sear off their beaks, so they can't do that anymore, which gives them infections. So then they get ill, so you pump them with antibiotics. So that doesn't happen anymore, but then you create super bugs because you've created this sort of, pool of resistance. And, so it's one thing on top of the other instead of solving the initial hole, which just leave them alone. And so that's an addictive logic where you keep needing the bigger hit, which is very, that's capitalism to a T, isn't it? You need the growth, you need the thing to keep growing to the point where it all collapses because you've destroyed the system. And I think Wallace was very, as you described, very attuned to that. That's the way it works. But I think he would argue that it sort of all comes from a place of wanting to give yourself away to something. That there's a loss, a feeling of alienation in the world that human beings try to fill, and with drugs, alcohol, entertainment, etc. And so I wonder, yes, because it seems that the sort of original sin, if you like, is perhaps very deep. It's the very first human domestication of animals, and it's the beginning of civilization, and it's the origins of all that. And perhaps it's a slightly noble savage idea or nostalgic sort of prelapsarian idea that you would return to paradise, and we would all probably be a little bit happier if we hadn't invented farming. And so from that very point, then capitalism as a system is simply a manifestation of a drive that's been going from the very beginning, which is now coming to its head, perhaps to the point where our interference in nature, our ability to supercharge that, has one endpoint. And yes, the consumption in food is, I don't know, we're just sort of lost souls in the middle of that. It feels like the one thing you can do is consume, and the one thing you can maybe resist is consumption in some way, but that ultimately feels very small compared to that larger system. I'm trying to wrap this up in my mind with your interesting ideas about the corporation as well. The corporation is sort of preying on that very impulse in the same way that social media companies, they're hijacking our natural evolution, because the world has gone way faster than we have, and they know exactly which buttons to push, exactly which way to manipulate the human animal in such a way that they can get exactly what they want from them, turn us into the resource, to turn us into objects, as you were saying. And that seems to me, food companies operate in the same way, don't they? They manufacture the flavors. This is Eric Schlosser in the Fast Food Nation and things in his recent work, that they're making it very, very difficult indeed to remain a person, I guess. I'm not sure if I answered your question, but yeah. Wallace is certainly an interesting lens through which to look at that, for sure.
Thank you. Unless anyone else has a very pressing question, we are running rather late at this point. Any other flash question, last moment? Or in the coffee break, that would also be okay. Well, with this, please join me in a big round of applause for Jamie Redgate.